They said the house was empty, just bricks, wood and silence. But I saw the curtain move, and in that moment I realized, some stories don't knock before they return. Some truths don't scream, they whisper, from behind lace and lies. What happened in that quiet village wasn't just a murder, it was a slow unraveling of love, fear and secrets stitched too tightly to survive. So tell me, would you have dared to look behind the curtain? It was the kind of morning in Eldon Hollow, where the sunlight fell in slanted sheets through mist that hadn't quite decided whether to lift or settle, and the breeze carried not just the scent of roses, but something subtler, like the hush before bad news. Miss Halwood, dressed in her faded blue gardening smock and her straw hat with its fraying ribbon, knelt silently by her foxglove bed, hands sunk into the soil with the reverence of someone who'd buried more than just bulbs. The garden was where she listened, not with her ears, but with something older and quieter inside her, a knowing that came from years of watching people pretend and plants refuse. She often said that gardens told the truth, some things refused to grow, no matter how carefully you tended them, while others blossomed wildly in darkness when no one was looking. From beyond the hedge, a slow murmuring approached like a shadow with feet, Mrs. Blight and Evelyn Mercer, their skirts brushing the dewy path as they leaned into each other's words like two birds nesting in gossip. A widow, they say, Mrs. Blight whispered, voice edged with the thrill of novelty. Elena Stroud, moved into Ashcroft. That house has been empty since Fenwick was found face down in the orchard, remember? Evelyn nodded, glancing over her shoulder toward the looming house that crouched behind its overgrown hedge like a secret refusing to be kept. The upstairs curtains always open, never drawn, not once. That window, tall, thin and oddly scented, had become something of a character in village conversation, like a mouth that smiled without warmth. It watched, and if you stared too long, you felt yourself being seen back. Miss Halwood pressed her trowel into the earth, eyes not lifting, but her mind already piecing things together like petals in a pressed book. Curtains, in her opinion, were the soul's punctuation, drawn tightly in fear, fluttering in temptation, wide open in defiance or despair. She rose slow and deliberate, every creak in her knees an echo of time spent observing what others ignored. The Ashcroft house had always unnerved her, the way the gravel on its drive never shifted, the way the hedges swallowed sound, and how even the birds hesitated in its branches. Elena Stroud walked the village lanes with her chin tilted slightly downward, not enough to seem ashamed, but enough to avoid questions, and the villagers, ever polite in tone but ruthless in curiosity, speculated with a hunger sharpened by silence. Then, one Thursday, news passed through the village like a rumor with legs. Mr. Stroud, whom few had seen but many had imagined, was dead. Just like that, dropped in the drawing room, Mr. Beale said over a sack of potatoes, his voice low but eager. Heart failure, they're saying, added Mrs. Langford, clutching her shopping basket like it might float away, in one of those dreadful crimson chairs she brought from the city. But he was fine, someone muttered. Walked the lane just yesterday. Looked solid. Miss Halwood said nothing, though she remembered him too, tall, not quite comfortable in his skin, with eyes that never landed on anything longer than a second. She recalled the way he fidgeted through church hymns, hands too still, and how his smile seemed more like an apology than a greeting. That evening, as the rain whispered against the glass of her drawing room and the clock ticked louder than it should have, she sat with her knitting untouched and her thoughts weaving darker threads, of a man too quickly gone, a woman too calm in the aftermath, and that upper curtain, which hadn't shifted a hair's breadth since the day they arrived. At the vicar's tea the following afternoon, the air was warm but the room felt chilled, voices careful, laughter shallow, as though the walls had grown ears. It was sudden, said Doc Willis, polishing his glasses though they were already clean. No signs, no warnings, just gone. But Miss Halwood wasn't listening to his words. She was watching his hesitation, the tiny pause between his breath and his sentence, the kind that came when someone rehearsed what they would say before saying it. And in that space between truth and performance, something bloomed quietly in her mind. Not just suspicion, but certainty. Something was watching from that window, and whatever had happened in Ashcroft had less to do with the heart that stopped beating, and more with the secrets that had been let in when that curtain was never drawn. They said it was too silent for a death, as if Colonel Everly hadn't died but had simply slipped into another room of existence, one where the clocks didn't tick, and footsteps made no sound. Found sitting upright in the sunroom, his fingers curled lightly around the armrest, the morning paper folded neatly beside him, untouched tea cooling at his elbow, and a peculiar look on his face, not of pain, but of pause, as if caught mid-thought. And while the doctor chalked it up to natural causes, the village wasn't quite so ready to tuck it away. No, not when the day before he'd been seen pacing near the larch gates with a face stormier than the sky above, muttering low and hard, and not when, according to Elsie, the maid with the fluttering voice and always polished shoes, there'd been a sharp exchange between the colonel and his wife in the hallway just after luncheon, one side fierce, the other disturbingly still, and then that sharp sound, like breath forced from the lungs not by grief but by impact. And yet Mrs. Everly's face at the wake had been a study in elegant sorrow, the kind practiced over porcelain cups and discreet sniffles, not red-eyed, not trembling, just impeccably dry, like a woman who had decided mourning must be done beautifully, or not at all. And it was that absence of rawness, that restraint so complete it bordered on performance, that unsettled Miss Alderton more than anything else. She'd watched Mrs. Everly's hands during the vicar's speech, fingers so still, folded in her lap like silk gloves pressed flat in a drawer, and she remembered how the curtain upstairs had been open again, drawn back deliberately though no one ever admitted to it, as if someone wanted to keep watch over the mourners below. "Too quiet," muttered Mrs. Penrose days later, pouring tea with hands that trembled more than usual, and the words carried in the hush like a warning disguised as small talk. Not weeping, not hollow, just muted, like grief wrapped in plastic. And then the fete arrived with its bunting, trestle tables, the smell of sugared almonds and grass trampled under little shoes, and amid the laughter came Jacob Turner, war evacuee turned village observer, who pulled at Miss Alderton's sleeve with the certainty of someone who had seen something no adult would believe, and said plainly, "I saw him again at the window. The man in the house with the white gate, same place as before, just standing there with his head tilted like he was listening." And though she said nothing aloud, Miss Alderton's heart beat a shade harder, because she too had seen the shape once, a figure faint and unmoving behind the upstairs curtain on a night. The rain was so thick it blurred the larch trees into ghosts, and just for a second, just long enough to question herself, she'd thought it looked down at her. And in a village like Elmsworth, truth was never shouted, only stirred into sponge cake and passed along with sugar cubes. And the stories, when they came soft whispers about broken promises, about voices raised once and never again, about the curtain that never quite settled right, and a man who may have died too quietly, because someone needed it that way. And now every evening Miss Alderton found herself watching the upper room of the Everly house, not out of curiosity, but with the quiet dread of someone who suspects the dead might still be waiting, not for justice but for someone to finally notice that they hadn't truly gone at all. Peter had noticed him first by the postbox, just standing there as if waiting for something, or someone, but doing nothing at all. Then again while he played marbles near the old fountain, and once more quite clearly, the day before the policeman arrived. Each time the man remained still, unblinking, as though made not of flesh but wax, posed deliberately behind a curtain in the upstairs window of the Larches, Miss Marple's eyes following the bustle of the square without directly settling anywhere, listened with a softness that belied her sharpness. "And how can you be sure it was the same man each time?" she asked gently. Peter considered, his brow furrowed. "His eyes," he said after a pause, "they didn't look at you, they looked into you like he was trying to see what you were hiding." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Not every tale needs a ghost, Peter." But Peter only shook his head with a grin. "He wasn't a ghost, miss. Ghosts move." He didn't, he just stood there, Sometimes Miss Marple believed children glimpsed truth more clearly, simply because they hadn't yet learned which truths adults were trained to ignore. At Mrs. Bartlett's luncheon the following Monday, the conversation inevitably drifted once again to Lydia Canforth. "She hasn't cried, not once," noted Miss Partridge, folding her napkin with a surgeon's precision. "Not in church, not at the greengrocer's, not even when the bishop's wife offered her condolences." "Perhaps some women carry grief in their bones," murmured Mrs. Weatherby, though she sounded as though trying to convince herself. "She doesn't carry it," said Mrs. Hartnell with finality. "She wears it like a brooch, something she pins on in the morning, removes at night." Miss Marple had seen Lydia earlier that day, stiff-backed at the market, choosing preserves for the church raffle. Her frame was not fragile, but unnaturally poised, rigid, like a marionette held together for display. Her eyes were dry, but they didn't seem to see anything in front of her. Instead they stared through things as if locked on something far off or buried deep within. "She has no family nearby?" Miss Marple asked in passing. "Just the niece," Mrs. Bartlett replied, "though they say she's not the colonel's by blood. Her brother had a child before he died in the war, at least that's what's whispered." Miss Partridge muttered something under her breath, but Miss Marple didn't press. In her experience, silence sometimes cloaked truth better than lies. Sometimes it meant something too heavy had been dropped into deep water, and what remained above was just the ripple. Days later, at the post office during an idle chat about gooseberry prices, Miss Marple found herself speaking with Mr. Ellis, the local handyman, a man more familiar with varnish than verse. "Did you do any repairs at the Larches recently?" she asked, almost offhandedly. Ellis grunted. "Upstairs drawer runners, swollen from the damp, nothing much, and the curtain rail," Miss Marple said, examining the stamps. "Jen, I heard it had jammed." Ellis shook his head, puzzled. "Didn't touch it. Moved fine when I checked. Smooth as butter." Miss Marple gave a vague smile, stepping out into the lane, but her eyes were drawn again to the Larches. Sunlight bounced from the upper windows, and the curtain, usually fixed open, now drifted halfway closed, quivering as if caught in decision to hide or to reveal. Explanations were plentiful: time, dust, decay, even grief, but Miss Marple had learned that when a story began to shift, it was best to look at what wasn't being said, at the small pauses between the spoken words, at the corners where truth liked to crouch unnoticed. And in St. Mary Mead, one never asked outright, not about money, nor marriage, and certainly never about mourning. Such questions were best approached sideways, like a bee-laden bush approached with care. So when Miss Marple wished to learn more of Lydia Canforth's history, she did not ask Lydia, but brought it up with Miss Ramsden, the church organist's sister, during a discussion of which hymnals needed rebinding. "Her husband was Harold, wasn't he?" Miss Marple remarked lightly. "Yes," said Miss Ramsden. "Captain Harold Canforth. Burma campaign. He never came home. Poor Lydia was only 20 then." Her voice trailed off, eyes clouding, as if recalling something too delicate, or too dangerous, to name aloud. And in that moment, Miss Marple felt it, that peculiar quiet that comes not when a truth has been spoken, but when it's been carefully left out. Miss Eliza Rayner had scarcely stepped into her 27th year, when fate dealt its quiet blow, returning home to Coldmere Hollow, a fog-wrapped village nestled in the folds of the Hampshire moors, with her niece Ava in tow, a girl no older than 16, and bearing the kind of silence that wasn't born from shyness but survival. After her sister's sudden passing, and the ambiguous disappearance of her brother-in-law, Jonathan Hale, a man stationed on some classified diplomatic post, Eliza took on the role of guardian without fuss or fanfare. Yet those who had known her in younger days said she changed after that. Her voice became softer, her laugh rarer, and her home slowly grew quieter, like a room where the clock had stopped ticking. She never remarried, never entertained companionship again, and when asked about Jonathan, she would offer a closed-lip smile that suggested not mourning but dismissal, as though the mere mention of him risked waking something she'd rather keep buried. "Some griefs don't cry," Miss Crowthorne once said during tea at the vicarage, her spectacles catching the firelight. "They turn cold and settle inside you like stone in the gut." It was Ava who drew more whispered than Eliza, though seen rarely, spoken of often, with her bone-pale skin, ash-blonde hair, and a demeanor that clung to shadows like ivy to brick. Miss Rayner had once seen her at St. Agnes Church arranging daffodils and chrysanthemums with a precision too careful for her years. She moved as if afraid to take up space, and when asked by Mrs. Fenwick to fetch lilies from the East Orchard, she froze for a heartbeat, glancing toward the door, not like a girl hesitating, but like prey checking for predators. She avoids glass, Mrs. Fenwick whispered later. Curtains always drawn. They moved her room to the back, you know, months ago. No one said why. In homes like Eliza's, such changes were never arbitrary. Moving a girl from a bright, airy room upstairs to the shaded, colder ground floor meant something had shifted, quietly, decisively. And Ava's subtle flinches when doors clicked shut or footsteps echoed too close spoke volumes of the silences between the walls. The bridge circle at Miss Locksley's house, where secrets often arrived disguised as speculation, offered more clues. Mrs. Denham had lowered her voice, always a sign of something not meant to be heard too widely, and muttered, "The solicitor came last week." Quietly. "Something to do with Ava's inheritance. Jonathan set up a trust, it seems, locked tight until she's of age. Eliza's just a custodian." A hush followed this, like dust settling over porcelain. "But she isn't her legal guardian, is she?" Miss Gratham asked, her voice a deliberate thread. "Not by law," said Mrs. Denham. "But she's been questioning the solicitor all the same. Margaret says he looked uncomfortable." Miss Rayner noted that in her thoughts not the words but the feeling underneath them. Money, in her experience, had a way of reaching into graves and pulling truths up by their roots. A few days later, in the drapery shop on High Street, she encountered Mrs. Lowen, who had kept house for the Hales for nearly 6 years. "Oh, I remember that house," she said, folding a swatch of plum-colored velvet. They smiled at each other, sure, but it was always a tight sort of kindness, like someone holding their breath. Eliza had her ideas about discipline and dignity. Jonathan had his secrets, quiet phone calls, locked drawers. I'd see him staring out the window at night, not blinking. Miss Rayner left the shop with more than her thread and lace that morning. She left with a creeping suspicion, the kind that scratches at the back of the mind like wind tapping on a shut window. And later, as she walked past Eliza's manor, she saw Ava sitting stiffly on the garden bench, hands folded like she was waiting for something inevitable. Her gaze was not fixed on the flowers or the sky, but on the attic window, half concealed by gauze curtains, that shifted ever so slightly despite the stillness in the air, as if something or someone had just drawn back from sight, or perhaps never left at all. The Whitmore house stood like an unsolved riddle draped in ivy and shadow, perched at the edge of the marshes where fog clung to the ground like secrets unwilling to rise. Time hadn't aged it gracefully, it had eroded it with intent, as though the house itself were trying to forget. Miss Adelaide Crane arrived just after the autumn rains, under the pretense of settling her late cousin Eleanor's affairs, though everyone in town suspected she was drawn by something deeper, some unfinished whisper of the past. She brought with her a calm demeanor, a sharp memory, and eyes that lingered a second too long on things others dismissed. Living with her now was young Clara, Eleanor's daughter, a girl whose silence was less innocence and more survival, her face serene, but her gaze evasive, as if she'd taught herself to look away from things the rest of the world had never noticed. The townsfolk said Clara had been different since her father's disappearance years ago. Victor Whitmore, a once brilliant archaeologist who'd returned from Crete, a changed man, erratic and withdrawn. One cold morning, he vanished, leaving only an unlocked study, an unspoken scandal, and a house that never quite exhaled. Miss Crane explored the manor with the polite detachment of someone searching for linens, but her mind recorded every nuance, the books untouched yet slightly rearranged, the kitchen clock always 5 minutes slow, and the heavy east wing door, sealed but never dusty. She asked nothing, but she sensed everything. At the solicitor's office, under the modest excuse of discussing parish grants, she learned that Victor had, shortly before his disappearance, attempted to pass all legal ownership to Clara in a frantic last-minute addendum. "Said it was urgent," murmured Mr. Penrose, fiddling with his cufflinks. But he looked frightened, not of death, but of something older. The draft was never filed. Later that week, while sipping tea at the vicarage, the Reverend's wife let slip that Clara still kept her father's ring in a tiny locked drawer, says it hums at night. When Adelaide next visited Whitmore House under the casual pretext of delivering hymnal revisions, she noticed Clara watching the walls, not with fear, but recognition. That evening, after Clara had gone to bed, Adelaide returned to the east wing. The door, thought locked, now hung slightly open. Inside, the air was stale, tinged with earth and iron. She found papers scattered across the desk, half-translated notes in Victor's hand, scribbled symbols, a torn page from a Greek manuscript marked, "Do not awaken what remembers blood." Beneath a floorboard lay a journal, entries ending abruptly. "The house listens. The house responds." As Adelaide stood frozen, the silence broke, not with sound, but with a shift in pressure, as though the house had drawn breath. She turned to find Clara at the threshold, her eyes hollow. "He said it would stop if I stayed quiet," the girl whispered. "But the house doesn't forget." That night, Adelaide lay awake, counting the ticks of the grandfather clock, until at midnight, the chiming halted abruptly on the 9th bell, and somewhere deep within the east wing, a floorboard sighed, slow and deliberate, like something rising. Outside, the marsh fog thickened, clinging to the windows like hands. The Whitmore house wasn't haunted by a ghost, Adelaide realized. It was haunted by a memory that still lived inside its walls. Her gaze, though seemingly idle, moved with a stillness sharpened by years of quiet observation, a stillness that missed nothing, not even the smallest shift of fabric in an untouched room. It was there, half hidden beneath time-worn sewing reels, and the brittle loops of thread faded by age, that her eyes found it, a folded letter, soft at the corners, its creases deepened by years of deliberate concealment. She did not reach for it, her fingers stayed still, but her eyes paused long enough to trace the fragile edge, where a single name was written in hesitant, slanted cursive. Eliza. The ink, though dulled, still carried a tremor, as if the hand that wrote it had hesitated more than once. Across the table, Isabel caught her glance, and with the barest flick of her fingers, swept the letter beneath a fold of muslin, as if the act of hiding it could erase its memory. "Just old scraps," he said. With an ease that sounded practiced, almost rehearsed, her eyes avoiding Margaret Vale's steady expression. But Margaret, who had spent a lifetime reading between silences, knew better than to believe what people said when their hands trembled ever so slightly. Letters that were written but never delivered, never stayed buried for long. They rotted beneath the surface, growing weight and shape, until the house itself began to carry them. And in that house, the weight was unmistakable. Eliza's name was one the villagers no longer said aloud, not since the winter she vanished without a trace. No funeral, no notice, just a closed window in the topmost room, and a silence that settled over the Harrow estate like fog refusing to lift. Then unexpectedly, years later, a man appeared, not announced, not invited, but walked the gravel path to the house, like someone retracing a sin. His shoes were worn to the sole, and he carried with him a battered leather case, the corners torn and frayed like an old soldier's conscience. No one knew his name at first, only that he limped badly, and reeked of gin and rain-soaked wool. Archer, who watched everything from behind her lace curtain,
said he stumbled straight to the front door,
shouting for Isabel, calling her by her maiden name, Isabel Thorne, and demanding to speak of what was left behind, of what they never buried right. That evening, the village whispered of raised voices echoing through the old Harrow walls, a heavy chair crashing to the floor, a sharp, sudden silence, and finally, the sound of glass breaking, followed by nothing but the wind. Margaret, ever discreet, inquired gently at the apothecary 2 days later, and it was Irene, timid Irene, who finally whispered the rest. "He said something happened out there in the jungle," she murmured, her eyes wide. "Said Captain Thorne wasn't the hero they claimed he was. Said he let the others die. That he made sure they did." But what made Margaret freeze was what came next. How the man claimed Eliza knew. That she had seen a letter, something not meant for her. And after that the laughter stopped, and one morning her room was locked, and no one spoke her name again. Margaret's thoughts twisted like thread pulled too tight. The facts didn't line up, not yet, but she recognized the scent of a secret trying desperately not to rot, and then came the piece she didn't ask for, but received by chance, a soft, offhand comment from Reverend Clements, while selecting hymns for the spring service. "Used to be a happy house, the Harrow place," he said, sipping tea absent-mindedly. "The nursery faced the orchard, full of light," they said. "That's the window with the torn curtain that never quite stays shut." Margaret nodded slowly, her eyes already miles away. That was the same window she'd seen flutter in windless dusk, the one room in the house no longer entered. The nursery, they said, hadn't been touched in years, not repurposed, not mourned, just sealed, as if the air itself remembered something it refused to release. That's what houses like Harrow did. They carried what the people refused to speak. That evening, as the sun melted into lavender and the corners of her sitting room filled with soft grey shadow, Margaret sat with her embroidery untouched, her needle paused mid-air as if waiting for permission to move. Her thoughts, however, did not rest. They pulled backward, to the folded letter, the locked nursery, the war stories soaked in blood and blame. There were clues, yes, a rewritten will. A soldier returned, not as a hero, but as a haunted man, a daughter vanished, and a woman who lived each day with a stillness too heavy to be called peace. But what chilled Margaret most was not the silence. It was the shape of the silence. It was how it spread, how it entered cups of tea, and sat in the space between sentences. Isabel had not been carrying calm all these years. She had been carrying the unbearable weight of protection withheld, of guilt repainted as survival, of something once done and never spoken of again. And Eliza, in her silence, had not simply disappeared. No, she had been displaced by fear, by choice, or perhaps by force. Because when a child vanishes, and a room is sealed and no one dares to explain why, then the truth is not gone. It's hiding, still breathing, and waiting, quietly, to be found. Silences in childhood often echo louder than screams, and Miss Caldwell knew that truth didn't always arrive with broken doors or court summons printed on fine paper. Sometimes, it hid in lowered shoulders, in the trembling of a teacup left too long on the table, or in curtains that stayed shut even when the sun was shining. Truth didn't always shout. Sometimes, it simply waited, stitched into the daily rhythm of life like a forgotten thread, hanging silently, until someone unknowingly tugged it free. The village, once again, was humming with rumors, but this time, it wasn't about inheritance or illness. This was different. Something unspoken had taken root in the air itself. At first light, a constable was called to Roseview Cottage. The back door was slightly ajar, the glass lock broken, but strangely, nothing inside was taken. No items missing, no mess, yet the whole house felt off, as if the air had been pulled in tight, like lungs holding a breath too long. One particular room, its curtain, always open for months, was now firmly drawn. "I always said that curtain gave me a strange feeling," Mrs. Darrington told the grocer, while Miss Caldwell, passing quietly, said nothing. She'd walked past the cottage that morning, and felt it instantly. Something had changed. That window wasn't watching anymore. It had turned its gaze away. Eleanor, the older sister, had told the constable everything was fine. Just a simple mistake. The door must have been left unlocked. But Miss Caldwell heard something else, an unnatural stillness in her voice. The kind of calm only people have when they're carefully balancing something broken inside. The village had its theories, wandering thieves, spirits, a lost traveler. But Miss Caldwell knew better. Some knocks didn't come to take, they came only to leave behind a shadow. In homes already steeped in unspoken things, silence itself becomes a theft, the most terrifying kind. By nightfall, concern had turned to fear. Clara was missing. Eleanor said she went to call her for dinner, but the room was empty, bed untouched, shoes gone. At first, no one panicked. Girls her age often wandered off for air when the weight in their heads grew heavy. But as the night deepened and rain began tapping against the windows like fingers trying to be let in, worry turned into dread. Around 2 in the morning, Miss Caldwell heard a knock, barely there, soft like a heartbeat, neither hurried nor hesitant. When she opened the door, what she saw wasn't a runaway child. It was a shadow wrapped in skin, soaked, shivering, arms folded tightly, as if holding back a scream that had been waiting for years. She said nothing, simply offered a shawl and stepped aside. Clara sat near the fire, silent, trembling. But then suddenly, her voice broke through the quiet. I didn't want to hear him again. That one sentence carried a weight deeper than any explanation. Miss Caldwell handed her dry clothes, brewed tea, asked nothing. She knew some truths aren't pulled out. They must be invited through silence. By dawn, Clara was curled on the couch, wrapped in wool, asleep like a child who hadn't known peace in days. Miss Caldwell just watched her, thinking, sometimes, running away isn't running at all. Sometimes, it's the only way to escape shadows that have learned your name. When Clara finally spoke again, her words came in fragments, fragile and cold, like stones in a shallow stream. I was asleep, then I heard his breathing. He didn't say anything, just stood there, like he used to. Miss Caldwell's knitting paused. Your uncle? Clara nodded slowly. He never spoke much, just watched. Even when I was little, he'd come into the nursery, said I reminded him of someone. Someone who left. Her fingers gripped the sweater's edge like it was the only solid thing left. It was worst when I was alone, she whispered. Mum said I imagined it. But Eleanor, she knew. Miss Caldwell said nothing. She listened, because Clara's words, though simple, were shaped by something deeper, like a lake hiding its darkness under calm water. And as the fire burned low, and morning crept across the faded wallpaper, Miss Caldwell realized, some houses don't hold photographs, only shadows, and sometimes, all it takes is one unlocked door for those shadows to wake again. The village clock had just struck 3, when the knock came, soft, deliberate, as though whoever stood outside wasn't entirely certain they should be there. Miss Weatherby, seated in her parlor, with the dying ember of the hearth casting a dull red glow across her account books, paused mid-stroke. The air had shifted, thickened somehow, as if the knock had stirred something more than sound. She opened the door without hesitation, and standing before her was a girl no older than 14, wrapped in a wool coat, several sizes too large, buttons mismatched, hair tangled and damp with fog. Her eyes, wide and vacant, spoke of something unspoken. It moved, she whispered, her voice barely louder than the breeze. The mirror, I saw it turn on its own. Miss Weatherby stepped aside without a word and let her in. She already knew which mirror the girl meant. The tall, warped one at number 11 Marrow Lane, the house no one ever stayed in long and everyone pretended not to fear. The stories about that place had long since become part of the village's soil, embedded into the walls of the bakery, murmured over fences and folded into gossip like sugar in tea. A child who vanished without a trace during the harvest fair. A soldier husband who returned from war broken and strange, only to disappear one fog-heavy night. A piano that had been heard playing in the dead of winter, though the house had no electricity, and the piano had been sold years ago. And now, more peculiar things. Footsteps overhead when no one lived above. The attic window, long bricked over, allegedly glowing faintly at dusk. The postman, a rational man with no time for superstition, recently began skipping that stop altogether. Even the birds, sharp and shrill in the rest of the village, flew in silence past Marrow Lane. Miss Weatherby had watched it all quietly. She'd seen Millie Fletcher, the normally bright child, start folding her drawings in half, always hiding the eyes. She'd overheard Miss Kemp, the mechanic, joke nervously that his wrench had gone missing after he walked past number 11, and he'd never walked that route again. And then there were the purchasers, Mrs. Caldwell buying candles by the dozens and asking about iron nails, old protection tales, dressed as idle curiosity. The final straw had come yesterday morning when Miss Weatherby discovered an unmarked envelope under the rectory gate. No handwriting, no seal, just thick paper that smelled faintly of mildew and something colder. Inside, a small black and white photograph of a door. Not her door. Not any door in the village, but a door that felt intimately familiar, as though it had once existed in a dream she'd long forgotten. Now, With the girl asleep on the couch and the fire low, she glanced toward her hallway, and saw the mirror, the one she'd inherited from her grandmother, standing slightly ajar. Not physically moved, but different. Its reflection no longer showed the hallway behind her, but another space entirely, a narrow room, dimly lit, with wallpaper that rippled like skin. And within that reflection stood a man whose shape was present but whose face was absent, as though it had been wiped clean, erased by something that had no use for identity. Miss Weatherby did not scream, she simply stood very still, her breath shallow, her fingers cold. The truth settled in her bones like winter. The house at number 11 wasn't haunted in the way people like to believe, not by trapped souls or lost memories. No, it was something worse. It was a door. And whatever had been knocking all these years, whatever had waited behind the mirror, had not forgotten. It had been watching. And now, it had begun to open. The letter arrived, not with a knock or a greeting, but slipped under the door like a secret that had waited too long to be told, its envelope yellowed with time, the corners curled as though it had traveled not just through distance, but through years of deliberate silence. The wax seal was old and fractured, the emblem so faded it looked more like a bruise than a crest, and the parchment carried a sterile scent of bleach beneath which lingered something fainter, dust, wilted lilies, and the cold breath of forgotten halls. Mrs. Hargreaves, who managed the village post and knew more than she claimed, handed it over with a peculiar look in her eye, one that trembled between pity and unease, and said nothing, only nodded before vanishing behind the creaking oak door. Evelyn Marsh, long estranged from the world beyond her iron gate, felt the weight of the envelope immediately. The handwriting, small and slanted, was unmistakably medical, tidy, exact, rehearsed. Inside were 4 carefully folded letters from a place she'd only heard whispers of as a child, St. Anselm's Restorative Clinic, an institution reputed to treat those whom society preferred not to see. Each letter, dated across nearly a decade, grew colder and more mechanical, like a machine giving up the pretense of care. The first had offered updates in soft language: condition stable, responds minimally, visitation declined. The second apologized for a missed response, noting Evelyn's father had ceased communication. The third stated plainly that patient Lydia Marsh remained under observation, her health unchanged. But it was the fourth, the last one, written in a hurried, almost nervous hand, that left Evelyn cold. Subject deceased. No familial response. Effects incinerated. File closed. It wasn't just the tone, it was the fact that the subject was her mother, Lydia Marsh. The same mother Evelyn had been told died giving birth to her. The lie was not only old, it had been woven into the foundation of her life, and now it cracked. The implications coiled around her like smoke. Her mother hadn't died, she'd been hidden, disappeared, locked away in a place where inconvenient women were sent, not for madness, but for seeing too clearly, or speaking too loudly. As rain tapped at the glass like impatient fingers, Evelyn recalled her childhood. The locked attic room, her father insisted was for storage. The faint hum of voices late at night, and the floral scent that drifted through the house on windless days, always gardenias, though none were planted. She remembered how her father never let her ask questions, how he changed the subject when she asked why she didn't have grandparents, or what the locked trunk in the attic held. That night, Evelyn ascended to the attic for the first time in years, the stairs groaning like they remembered her weight. The padlock on the third-floor room broke open with eerie ease, rust crumbling like bone. Inside was stillness, so complete it rang in her ears. Dust blanketed everything in grey silence, but the room was unmistakably lived in once. A narrow bed with iron posts, a journal with no name, and a mirror covered in cloth that trembled as if something beneath had breathed. When she pulled the cloth away, the glass did not show her reflection. It showed the room as it had been: fresh, clean, inhabited. A woman sat on the bed, humming faintly, brushing her hair with long, slow strokes. Her face was soft but wrong, as though time had blurred its details. Evelyn stood frozen, heart thundering in her chest, unable to look away. The woman turned, not with malice, but recognition. A single aching look passed between them, and Evelyn felt something inside her fracture, not from fear, but from truth finally touching bone. This was no ghost. This was memory, preserved where love had been denied, and lies had flourished. The mirror began to fade, the image dissolving into fog, but not before the woman raised a hand, slow, deliberate, reaching. Evelyn did not scream. She only stepped forward, because in that moment she understood what had been stolen, not just a mother, but a legacy, a story, a voice. And now, long buried under silence, it had returned not to haunt, but to be heard. And the house, no longer a shelter of lies, exhaled its truth at last. The storm had long passed, but in the weathered bones of Elmridge Hollow, the silence was a creature in itself, thick, alert, coiled like breath, held in the chest of something ancient and unfinished. The house did not rest. It waited, not for comfort, but confession. It wasn't a telegram, nor the clatter of hooves that stirred the past. It was the return of Elliot Thorne, unannounced, uncelebrated, with a limp that spoke of battles both abroad and within, and eyes darkened by the weight of things left unsaid. No one in the village had expected him, and none remembered exactly why he'd vanished the night the west wing of the hollow burned, only that after that night, things changed. The laughter stopped, the curtains stayed drawn, and the house grew cold. Now he was back, moving through the ancestral halls with an unnerving ease, touching worn banisters and drawing-room knobs as though claiming old rights, ignoring dust like a man brushing aside ghosts. His elder brother Charles, once master of the estate, had died under circumstances both vague and convenient. A fall, they said, though no autopsy was ever mentioned, and the only witness was a footman who later drowned in the lake. Elliot spoke little of his travels, never of the war, and not at all of his brother, whose portrait had been quietly removed from the main hall. Miss Hartley, once companion to the late matron, watched from the shadows of the library arch, tea growing cold in her lap, spine drawn taut with suspicion not born of instinct but of memory. She remembered a boy too clever, too quiet, and a girl, Margaret, whose screams once echoed from the nursery before it was sealed, and whose name had since been banished like a curse. Now young Clara, Charles's daughter, or so it was believed, wandered those same halls, caught between affections she didn't trust, and a legacy she barely understood. Elliot called her, my dear, gave her gifts with silver ribbons and subtle strings, spoke of futures in Switzerland, of trust funds and academic sponsors, but every kindness felt like a chain, every smile like the calm before a door slammed shut. Beneath the surface of politeness, darker questions began to stir like rot in the beams. Why had Charles dismissed every nurse Clara ever trusted? Why did the family solicitor flinch at Elliot's name? Why had the birth certificate in the vicar's records listed Margaret Thorne, born the same year as Clara, yet with no mention of the mother, only a strange footnote marked transferred custody, sealed by request? Mrs. Denby, the blind governess, muttered at dusk of a child who was replaced, of blood hidden behind education, and promises made in the garden shed the night of the fire. The ledgers, once pristine, now revealed scorched pages, amended entries, and a will signed not by Charles, but by someone with a left-handed slant. Elliot's perhaps, forged under the guise of grief. When Mr. Greaves, the solicitor, returned to examine the Hollow's deeds, he found the original ownership altered, the family seal smeared, and in the corner of a torn document, a name circled in ink and trembling script, Elliot Thorne, rightful heir. Miss Hartley knew then what must be done. She invited the necessary few with whispers, not invitations. Clara, pale and wary. Mr. Greaves, who now carried more doubts than contracts. The constable, who had once courted Margaret before she vanished. And Reverend Eldon, whose ledger of the dead contained omissions even he didn't understand. They gathered in the drawing-room beneath the eyes of the Hollow's first mistress, whose portrait, cracked with age, seemed to watch with judgment. And there Miss Hartley began, not with accusations but revelations. Her voice was gentle, but it carved through silence like a scalpel. This house, she said, was not built on blood, but it has absorbed its fair share. As the fire hissed and flickered, the walls seemed to exhale, and the truth began to slither forth, slow, cold, irrefutable. Elliot had not returned to mourn a brother, or care for a niece, he had returned to rewrite a legacy, to silence a past too dangerous to be known, to erase a child who should never have disappeared, and to secure what he always believed was his by right, not by truth. But Elmridge Hollow, for all its age, had a memory longer than any man's ambition. And some secrets, especially those buried beneath floorboards and sealed nursery doors, do not stay silent forever. In the final pause, as Miss Hartley met Elliot's unflinching gaze, there was no need for verdicts. The house itself had spoken, and some houses, especially those built on lies, remember everything. Ashbridge Hall had long stood like a wounded relic of forgotten power, its ivy-draped walls and fractured stained glass windows silently bearing witness to generations of concealed sins and rehearsed silence. Yet when Meredith Vale reappeared at its threshold, after nearly 14 years of absence, the very air around the estate seemed to still, as if the house itself held its breath. No one spoke her name aloud, not in the village tavern, where rumors now spilled faster than ale, not among the stiff-lipped staff, who had served the Vale family through decades of quiet rot, and certainly not within the manor itself, where the clocks had begun, curiously, to run backward in the east wing. She arrived unannounced, wearing the same camel-colored coat she'd last been seen in, her face pale but not broken, her fingers wrapped around a leather ledger that bore the faint scent of mildew and old fire. Inside the book were no finances, no inventories, just names, dates and initials beside phrases like dismissed abruptly, transferred by order, and observation ceased. In the great hall, portraits had shifted slightly, as if recoiling from the truth she brought with her. The butler, Elcott, who had once served her father, found the music room piano playing faint notes at dusk, though the lid remained closed and the keys untouched. In the nursery, long sealed since the death of young Elijah, Edwin Vale's illegitimate son, whose drowning had always felt too neat, a faint scent of lavender and iron began to drift in the evenings, and a rocking horse moved faintly in the shadows, despite no living child having stepped into that room for over a decade. Meredith, calm and unflinching, made no accusations, she simply asked questions, soft as wind through leaves. Why did the nursemaid leave the day after Elijah's death? Who signed the second death certificate for Lady Cressida, when the first had already been filed? And why was a patient at St. Augustine's Hospital kept under two identities, one as Meredith Vale, and another as Subject 403? Her presence was like a blade slipped beneath old wallpaper, peeling back years of cover until the mold beneath began to breathe. It was Imogen, her cousin, and now mistress of the estate, who began to fray, first with fragmented memories, then with dreams of rooms she swore she'd never entered, and finally, with a quiet admission. He said I must never ask what happened in the cellar. Never go near the Red Room after midnight. And always, behind it all, the looming shadow of Edwin Vale, dead, revered, and yet strangely present. The townspeople remembered how swiftly Meredith had been declared unstable, how conveniently her testimony had been buried under prescriptions and legal guardianship, all signed off by men with clean hands and dirt under their nails. But now, as the fires in Ashbridge's hearths burned a little colder, and the ancestral bells rang at irregular hours, something shifted, something long buried stirred. The local doctor, Dr. Lestrange, recalled an old patient file misfiled under non-standard behavioral study, and found it annotated in Edwin's hand, referring to Meredith not as a niece, but as a potential threat to narrative stability. It was then clear, she hadn't been mad, just inconvenient, not delusional, but dangerous, to a story carefully constructed by a man who had rewritten his family history like a novel in progress. And now, the ending was being challenged. In the drawing room, where the chandelier never stopped swaying even when windless, Meredith placed the ledger on the table, and quietly spoke, not to Imogen, not to the staff, but to the house itself. I remember everything, what they took, what they hid, and what they feared I'd bring back. That night, the eastern corridor was sealed again, but not before a second body was found, long decomposed, tucked behind the bricked nursery wall, clutching a silver locket inscribed with MV. For the first time in decades, the bells rang 12 times without faltering, as if marking not midnight, but justice. Meredith didn't stay to explain, she didn't need to. Ashbridge Hall, now awake, would whisper the truth forever. The papers had been signed, the ink still fresh, poised like a verdict waiting to be spoken aloud. But what lingered unspoken was Eleanor's absence, palpable, ghost-like, the one silence that filled every room louder than a scream. He mentioned arrangements in that sterile, detached voice I had come to associate with things ending, just as he once mentioned Cordelia in passing, not as a loss, but as a misstep to be corrected. That voice, clinical, calculated, was the same tone he used to discuss pruning rose stems or dismissing servants. And in that moment something in the back of my mind stirred. The locked room, the curtain never fully drawn, the scent of violets clinging to velvet fabric untouched for years. I remembered the way Eleanor once stood inside it, not quite hiding, not quite visible, like someone halfway between staying and vanishing. Now her breath caught as I said her name, not out of guilt, but out of a deeper, heavier dread. She didn't deny anything, she didn't speak, but her stillness confessed what her words refused to carry. Beatrice's voice then, quiet but splintered at the edges, cut through the room like a thread pulled taut. I didn't hate him, I feared him, but not because I was weak. I feared what he called love, what he turned it into, and I knew what he was capable of, what he had already done. I couldn't let him take her too. A long breathless hush followed, an airless silence so thick that even the teacups seemed to tremble. No one objected, no one protested. They simply listened, the truth finally finding air after years locked beneath civility. Miss Halloway, her hands folded over her lap like petals in prayer, spoke then, softly, with the gravity of someone who had lived long enough to understand. There are murders born of rage, hot, brutal, swift, others of fear, messy, desperate, cowardly. But the rarest kind, perhaps the most sorrowful, are those born from love, twisted love, yes, but love nonetheless. Her words hung in the room, tender and damning all at once. No judgment came, no handcuffs were summoned, because Miss Halloway, like the village itself, knew justice was not always about shackles or retribution. Sometimes, it was about truth unearthed, about giving voice to the silences no one dared name. Outside, the garden bore the bruises of last night's wind. The roses bent low, their petals clinging to stems like tired mourners. Miss Halloway stepped among them later that evening, her skirt brushing leaves damp with grief, her movements delicate, as if afraid the ground itself might weep. The village had begun, slowly to resume its rhythm. The grocer reopened with talk of jam jars, the children returned to skipping ropes, and the vicarage once more rang with distant hymns. But Eleanor and Beatrice had vanished. No farewell, no final embrace, only a short, precise note folded within a hymnal, and left where only someone who cared would find it. There was no drama in their leaving, only a dignified silence, like a breath held too long finally released. Miss Halloway returned to her parlor, her teacup now lukewarm, and glanced at the window. The curtain fluttered gently, but without tension, as though even the wind had exhaled. The estate on Hollowend Lane stood hushed, not abandoned but resigned. The upstairs curtain remained drawn, a gesture not of secrecy but of finality, as if the house itself had chosen no longer to observe the world. No letters came, no footsteps echoed up the stone path, and yet, the postman still paused by habit more than hope. Miss Halloway passed by sometimes, never lingering. She believed some stories did not require retelling, not because they lacked importance, but because their weight had already been carried. It was never truly about endings. No, it was about the illusions we called safety, the lies we tucked behind lace curtains and polite small talk, the truths we buried beneath routines. The curtain that once represented surveillance had become a symbol of surrender. Some evils wore no fangs, made no noise. They whispered in parlors. They wrapped themselves in propriety. They discussed inheritance and family names with gentle smiles and gloves that never seemed to wrinkle. And yet, they left fingerprints in the haunted eyes of daughters, in the careful steps of wives, in the lingering scent of lavender on skin too afraid to flinch. Miss Halloway lifted her cup again, steady, her gaze distant. Yes, she thought, evil rarely howls. It hums, it offers you tea. It lives next door and never forgets your birthday. In villages like theirs, the most terrifying secrets were never shouted in alleyways. They were preserved, sweetly, perfectly, like pressed flowers in a book no one ever dared open twice. In the end it wasn't a scream, or a trail of blood that revealed the truth. It was a silent curtain, a trembling girl, with fear and understanding written across her face, and an elderly woman whose eyes noticed the things others deliberately chose to ignore. Miss Marple reminded us, once again, that evil doesn't always arrive with noise or drama. Sometimes, it sits among us, smiling softly, pouring tea, dressed in the calm disguise of duty, tradition, and family. It doesn't yell or rage. It simply trims the garden every Thursday, speaks gently at dinner, and hides its darkness behind flawless manners. But in the eyes of those willing to truly see, the mask begins to slip. Justice moved at its own pace, quietly, patiently, like the ticking hands of an old clock, each moment hiding a secret of its own. And perhaps the true mystery was never about how the crime was committed, but why someone felt it had to be. What buried pain, what unspoken past, what years of silent endurance drove a woman to break every rule she had ever been taught, to turn her back on what the world called virtue? What form of love was so desperate, so fierce, that it pushed a mother to do what others would call a sin, but her soul called salvation? And now, dear listener, the question turns to you. If you had been in Lydia's place, would you have waited? Would you have stayed silent, hidden behind that same curtain? Or would you have pulled it shut with your own hand, choosing to write your own ending, no matter the cost? Would you have endured what society expected? Or would you have chosen the dangerous path of defiance in the name of protection? We'd truly love to know. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell us what stayed with you, what detail lingered, or even the theory that formed in your mind. Every perspective unlocks another layer of this story, another flicker of light in the shadows. And if this quiet storm of secrets and sorrow made its way into your heart, if you felt the weight of every glance, every silence, every unspoken truth, then be sure to subscribe to the channel and share this story with a fellow mystery lover. So many secrets still remain, hidden behind locked doors, hushed voices, and curtains that never seem to stop moving. Until next time, stay sharp, stay curious, and above all, never trust a curtain that won't close.